The wind over southern Iraq carries more than dust. It carries memory. Beneath the dunes, beneath the crust of time, there lies a city once so radiant that its name became a whisper to the gods. Yet for thousands of years, no one knew it existed. It was buried, drowned not by the sea, but by forgetting. In the spring of 1625, a man rode across this wasteland. His name was Pietro della Valle, a nobleman from Rome, a wanderer driven not by conquest, but by grief. His wife had died on this journey, and he carried her embalmed body with him in a wooden coffin, wrapped in silk and tears. He rode eastward through a land at war, between the fading Ottomans and the rising Persians, seeking solace in ruins, seeking proof that even the greatest empires fall. It was there, at the edge of the desert near a small village called Mughair, that his horse stumbled upon a mound of broken brick. Pietro dismounted. The sun burned the horizon into copper, and the air trembled. He brushed away the sand and found a fragment of clay, heavy in his hand, marked with strange wedges pressed into its surface. Lines, patterns, symbols, not Arabic, not Greek, not Latin. It was a voice older than any language he knew. He picked up another and another. Each fragment bore the same mysterious writing. The ruins stretched before him, terraces, walls, steps leading nowhere. Pietro realized he was standing inside the bones of a vanished world. He did not know the name of this place. He could not read the marks. But the dust clinging to his boots had once been the foundation of humanity's first city. The clay in his hands held the first words ever written. He gathered a handful of those tablets and sealed them in his luggage. He carried them back across oceans to Rome as relics of a forgotten race. Scholars would examine them centuries later and finally give them a name. Sumer. Welcome to Empire's Historical. What you're about to hear is not just the story of a civilization. It's the story of the first attempt of humankind to defy chaos, to build meaning out of mud, to make memory eternal. It is the story of those who raised temples from the dust, invented the idea of time, and then inevitably lost it. But before we tell of their gods and kings, we must begin here, with the silence after the storm, and a man alone in a sea of ruins. Because history doesn't start with victory, it starts with discovery. Look at the desert around him, a wasteland rippled by wind, each dune like the fold of an ancient shroud. The sun stands like a sword over the land. Somewhere beneath his feet lies Ur, once the beating heart of the world. But in 1625, it is nothing, just cracked earth, bone-dry air, and fragments of stone that crumble at a touch. And yet, there is something strange here. The way the horizon bends, the way the air holds its breath, as if the desert itself is waiting for someone to remember. Imagine Pietro lowering himself beside those bricks, tracing one of the marks with his finger. It's just a wedge pressed into clay. But it carries a heartbeat older than Egypt, older than the pyramids, older even than the word civilization. He could not have known that those tiny impressions, made by a reed stylus in soft clay, were the first attempt of our species to capture thought, to freeze time, to say, we were here. When he left, the wind covered his footsteps. The desert closed its mouth again. The ruins returned to silence, but the clay remained, whispering beneath the sand, waiting for someone to listen. And that is where our story begins. Long before Rome, before Athens, before Babylon, there was a people who called themselves the Black-Headed Ones. They lived between two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, in a land both cursed and blessed. A land where water was life and death at once. A land that demanded obedience and offered immortality. The Sumerians. But we will reach them soon enough. For now, picture only this: a man kneeling in the burning dust, holding the first written words of humankind without knowing what they meant. There is poetry in that. A living man holding the echo of the dead. A civilization forgotten, resurrected by accident. History gasping back to life through the fingers of a traveler. He could not read the clay, but the clay could read him. Because the ruins remember. The earth remembers. And if you listen closely, so will you. If this is your first time with us on Empire's Historical, don't forget to subscribe and support our work, so we can keep bringing you the lost worlds, the buried cities, and the civilizations that built the bones of our modern age. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the desert. The year is 1625. A man stands over ruins that once held 50,000 souls. The air hums with heat, and silence presses against the world like a second skin. Beneath his feet lies Ur, the city of the moon god, cradle of kings, birthplace of writing. But in this moment, it is only dust. He lifts one brick to the light, turning it in his hands as if he might glimpse the reflection of its makers. He cannot know that this simple act, the lifting of a single fragment, will one day open a window into the dawn of humanity. The story you are about to hear begins not with a king or a battle, but with a question whispered across 4,000 years of silence. Who built the first city? And why did they fall? When Pietro della Valle rode away from the ruins of Ur, he did not look back. The wind was rising. The desert had already begun to reclaim what little he had disturbed. And yet somewhere inside his satchel, the clay tablets shifted softly against each other, like hearts still beating under stone. He did not know that he carried the first messages ever written by human hands. Not prayers to a god, nor letters of love, but records of grain, of trade, of laws, the scaffolding of a civilization that had once believed it could outlast death itself. Centuries would pass before anyone would decipher them. Scholars would gather in London, Paris, and Berlin. Linguists would pore over the markings, realizing that these strange wedges formed the earliest script ever created, cuneiform. They would uncover the names of kings, of priests, of cities that had vanished into myth. And through them, Ur and the people of Sumer would live again. Imagine it, an empire so ancient that it stood more than 2,000 years before the first pyramid was laid in Egypt. A world where writing, mathematics, and organized religion were not inherited. They were invented. Where humankind looked upon chaos and decided to carve order into clay. But when Pietro first touched those ruins, none of that was known. All he saw was desolation, brick melted by centuries of heat, ziggurats reduced to hills of dust, shards of pottery scattered like bone. To him, it was only death. But to us, now, it is memory. For beneath that silence, the desert was speaking. It was telling him, and us, that everything built by human hands is temporary, but the idea of building endures. Perhaps that is why his story feels haunting, because in every civilization's fall, we glimpse our own. We live, we build, we forget. And one day, someone else will kneel among our ruins and wonder who we were. The sun over southern Iraq has not changed. The same light that once glinted off the bronze helmets of Sumerian soldiers now burns over oil fields and concrete roads. The rivers still twist through the land, and the air still carries the taste of salt and dust. Yet what they once nourished, a network of cities, of temples, of poets and dreamers, is gone. What remains are fragments, a wedge in clay. A single line that reads, "The king built the temple, and the temple endured." But it did not endure. Nothing ever does. Still, what is history if not the struggle against forgetting? That is why this story matters, because buried under that desert was not just a civilization, but the beginning of us all. Long before empires rose on marble and steel, before kings carved their faces into mountains, there were people who built with clay and faith. They built not just walls, but words. They turned breath into permanence. And in doing so, they became immortal in the only way that matters. The ruins Pietro found were not merely architecture. They were the fossilized imagination of humankind. Every brick was a thought. Every mark was a voice. And together, they spoke one truth. To build is to believe that tomorrow exists. That belief, fragile and magnificent, is what made us human. When you think of the Sumerians, do not picture a distant, primitive people lost in the haze of antiquity. Picture us. Picture the same hunger to organize chaos, to understand the stars, to leave a trace that says we were here. They were the first to name the days, to measure time, to bind law to ink, to shape cities as reflections of the heavens. In every calendar we use, in every written word, in every act of planning, their ghosts remain. And it all began here, with a man kneeling in the sand, lifting a shard of clay to the sun. It's almost poetic, isn't it? That the story of civilization begins not with creation, but with rediscovery, with loss first, then remembrance. When Della Valle carried those tablets home, he believed he was bringing back curiosities, relics for collectors. He didn't realize he was carrying the seed of humanity's oldest dream, to leave something that would outlive us. He didn't know that the city beneath his feet had been called Ur, and that from its walls came kings and merchants, astronomers and poets. He couldn't have imagined that this wasteland was once the capital of the moon god, that its priests once charted the stars and counted the months, that here began the very notion of time. In the centuries since, archaeologists have uncovered the truth. They have found the royal tombs of Ur, jewelry wrought with gold and lapis lazuli, instruments buried with musicians, skulls of servants sacrificed beside their lords. They have found the great ziggurat, its steps now eroded, but still climbing toward the heavens like a memory refusing to die. All of it began in that same dust Pietro brushed away. The desert is cruel. It devours everything: palaces, armies, entire histories. But sometimes, if you listen closely, it gives something back. A whisper, a clue, a beginning. And that beginning is what we will follow. Back through the millennia, into the dawn of the first city, where rivers made kingdoms and men made gods. Because in the end, the question is not just what happened to the Sumerians. The question is, what will happen to us? History does not move in straight lines. It turns in circles. Civilizations rise, they burn, they are buried. And then, if they are lucky, someone finds them again. Perhaps one day, far in the future, another traveler will walk across the skeleton of our world through glass and rust and silence and find what we left behind. Maybe they will pick up a fragment of metal, a scrap of writing, and wonder, just as Pietro did, who were these people? And what did they dream of? That is the power of Sumer. It is not just the first civilization, it is the first mirror. And as we begin this journey through its rise and fall, remember, every empire ends in dust. But in that dust, something eternal survives. The desire to be remembered. Welcome to Empires Historical. Now, let us return to the place where it all began, between two rivers, in a land of heat and silence, where a handful of wanderers built the first city the world had ever seen, and in doing so, created the idea of civilization itself. And when they were gone, the desert waited, because the desert always remembers. Before there were kings, before there were empires, there was the land. And the land was a paradox. It was neither desert nor garden, but something between, a fragile seam where creation and desolation met. To the east rose the brown highlands of Persia, to the west, the endless sands of Arabia. Between them lay a plain, wide, flat, shimmering beneath a sun that burned without mercy. Two rivers crossed it, serpents of life cutting through stone and salt, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This was Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, and it would become the cradle of all civilization. Yet to those who first set foot upon it, it must have looked like a curse. The heat alone could blister bone. In summer, the wind scoured the ground into glass. In winter, floods rolled down from the mountains without warning, sweeping away everything in their path. The earth cracked like old pottery, and when the floods receded, they left behind a gray film, silt, fine as ash, the residue of mountains ground to dust. That dust would become destiny. Every year, the rivers destroyed and renewed, drowned and delivered. And in that rhythm of death and rebirth, the first humans who wandered into this land began to understand something no creature before them had ever known. The chaos could be shaped. They learned to dig channels, to guide the flood, to coax the river's rage into gentle streams. In time, they learned to plant, to wait, to harvest, to live not by the hunt, but by the calendar of the earth. This was the first covenant between humankind and nature, not written in words, but in mud and sweat. The rivers would give life, but only to those who obeyed their temper. Order, then, was born not from philosophy, but from necessity. From struggle came structure. From water, civilization. Here, every seed was an act of faith. To place grain into the mud was to believe in a tomorrow that did not yet exist. They built their first homes near the water's edge, huts of reed and clay, bound by river grass, and in those fragile walls began the long experiment we now call history. From this plain, every city that ever rose would inherit its form. The grid of Ur, the markets of Babylon, the columns of Rome, the boulevards of Paris, all would trace their lineage back to these first rectangles of mud. But it began humbly. The first people of this land were not conquerors or kings. They were the Ubaid, fishermen, farmers, craftsmen who watched the seasons change and learned to speak the language of the soil. They found that the world could be built, that time could be measured, that human hands could shape permanence from impermanence. Their settlements grew, spreading along the rivers like constellations mirrored in water. From Eridu to Uruk, from Lagash to Kish, the plain bloomed with invention. At Eridu, they built the first shrine, a platform of packed earth to honor the spirits of rain and fertility. It was small, no higher than a man's shoulder. But over generations, they rebuilt it again and again upon the ruins of the old, layering shrine upon shrine until it reached the height of a hill. That mound became sacred. And from that idea, that the divine could be elevated above the earth, rose the ziggurat, the temple tower that would define the skyline of Sumer. So it was that architecture was born not from ambition, but from remembrance. Every new layer honored the past. Every brick carried the memory of another brick. The act of building became the act of preserving, a quiet defiance against the erasure of time. It is easy to imagine them at dusk, the sky bleeding red as the sun fell behind the western horizon. The river glimmered like liquid fire. Smoke rose from hearths. Somewhere a child pressed his hand into soft clay, leaving the imprint of fingers that would outlive empires. They did not know it then, but they were becoming something extraordinary, the first people to imagine a future. The rivers taught them patience, the floods taught them fear. They learned to build dikes and reservoirs, to mark the seasons by the movement of the stars. And in that gaze upward, humanity found its mirror. The sky became a clock, the heavens a scroll upon which the story of time was written. From necessity came wonder, from survival, faith. In this land, gods were not born in the mountains or in the sea. They were born in irrigation canals and granaries, in the daily miracle of grain rising from mud. To those who lived between the rivers, divinity was not distant. It was in the hands that planted, in the water that rose, in the walls that held back the flood. And yet, every blessing bore its shadow. For the same rivers that fed their fields could turn overnight into serpents of death. Entire villages were swallowed, families swept away. The gods, it seemed, could not be trusted, and so they built walls, not to keep enemies out, but to keep fear in. The first city was not a fortress. It was a prayer made of clay. Eridu, they called it, the foundation of the world. The oldest city ever to stand. Around its temples gathered those who believed that life could be managed, measured, controlled. They learned to divide labor, to assign tasks, to keep records of offerings and trade. The world was no longer wild, it was organized. From this came a revelation that power could be born not from strength, but from structure. The seed of government was sown beside the seed of wheat. And as the years passed, Eridu begot Uruk, and Uruk begot Ur. Each city larger, more complex, more magnificent than the last. From reeds to brick, from huts to palaces, from symbols carved in clay to the first words of history, the people between the rivers had done the unthinkable. They had turned the chaos of the world into order. And with that, the first civilization took its breath. Yet the wind over Mesopotamia still whispered of danger. The rivers that had birthed life could just as easily unmake it. The floods returned, the droughts deepened, and the earth demanded tribute. Each harvest was a negotiation with death, so they built higher, dug deeper, prayed louder. And in those prayers, in that endless battle between fear and faith, humanity found its voice. They called it writing. At first, their writing was not meant for poetry or prayer. It was meant for survival. The symbols they pressed into wet clay were not stories, but numbers. The count of cattle, the measure of barley, the weight of silver. Yet in those marks lay the seed of every story ever told. For once, a people begin to record, they begin to remember. And once they begin to remember, they begin to dream. Every mark was a contract with eternity. Each wedge of a reed stylus was a heartbeat trying not to fade. On tablets stacked in the temples of Eridu and Uruk, the Sumerians recorded not only the debts of men, but the gifts of gods. From commerce came conscience, and from counting came faith. Look closer. These were not just farmers and traders. They were philosophers in clay. They had begun to see patterns in the flood and the harvest, in the stars and the seasons. They measured the length of shadows, the turning of the moon. They understood that time could be divided into hours, into days, into years, and that the world itself could be quantified. From their mathematics came our minutes, our degrees, our sense of the eternal circle of 60. All of it born from mud. The rivers had given them more than food. They had given them rhythm, a pulse that matched the beating of their own hearts. The world was not chaos anymore. It was music, yet harmony is never permanent. As their cities grew, the land began to change. Forests vanished, fields widened, the soil whitened with salt. The same irrigation that had made the desert bloom began to poison it. They did not yet understand that every act of creation carries the weight of destruction behind it. The gods, once generous, began to turn their faces away, and so the people turned inward. They built temples larger than before, reaching upward in defiance of the sky. The ziggurat became both monument and plea, a stairway for men to climb toward gods who no longer listened. Imagine standing there at the edge of Uruk as the dawn burns over the plain. Before you rises the temple of Inanna, its bricks painted white and red, its summit gleaming with copper in the morning light. Around it sprawls the city, thousands of houses packed close, smoke rising from hearths, the scent of baking bread and bitumen. This is not a village anymore. This is a civilization, breathing, sweating, thinking. Inside the temple, a priest records the offerings of grain. His stylus scratches against clay, a sound small and insignificant, yet one that will echo for 5,000 years. Outside, merchants argue in the marketplace. Sailors unload jars of oil from distant ports. Children chase each other between the alleys. The hum of life fills the air. They have done it. They have built a world from nothing. But even here, amid triumph, there is unease. For the rivers still decide their fate. The rains can fail. The floods can come too soon. A single season of misfortune can erase a decade of prosperity. They know it. And in that knowledge lies the birth of religion. To live in Mesopotamia was to live with uncertainty. And so they invented gods to hold the balance steady. Each city had its own divine patron. Enki at Eridu, Inanna at Uruk, Nana at Ur. The gods were not distant. They were as real as the riverbanks, as temperamental as the flood. To appease them, the people offered food, song, labor. In return, they asked for nothing more than another sunrise. Faith became their architecture. Each temple was a mountain made by men, each priest a mediator between flesh and eternity. Through ritual, they imposed meaning on the unpredictable. Through story, they made sense of suffering. And in that act of storytelling, of weaving myth from fear, humanity learned the greatest power it would ever possess, the ability to imagine what is not and call it truth. In their myths, the gods shaped men from clay, the same clay men now shaped into bricks. In those myths, the flood became punishment and renewal, destruction and salvation. The Sumerians did not worship from ignorance. They worshipped from understanding. They had seen what the world could do, and they knew they could not control it. Their faith was not arrogance, it was awe. For centuries, the balance held. The rivers fed the fields fed the people, and the people fed the gods. Cities multiplied. Trade stretched as far as Anatolia and the Indus. Silver, copper, and lapis lazuli crossed deserts and seas. The black-headed people, as they called themselves, had built the first network of human endeavor, a web of exchange that bound earth to heaven. But even as they flourished, they sensed the fragility of it all. The soil beneath them was thin. The rivers that gave them life could one day change their course. And the gods, if angered, could sweep their works away in a single storm. The Sumerians responded the only way they knew how. They wrote. They recorded their triumphs, their laws, their prayers. They pressed their fears into clay and baked them hard against time. Each tablet was a defiance of death, each inscription a declaration that memory would outlast ruin. They could not stop the flood, but they could teach the future how it felt to drown. When we read their words now, the hymns to Inanna, the laments of lost cities, the hymns carved into broken tablets, we are hearing the echo of the first human realization that nothing lasts, and that this impermanence is what makes life sacred. The land between the rivers was never meant to be peaceful. It was meant to teach. It taught us to build. It taught us to record. It taught us to endure. And in its endless struggle between abundance and annihilation, humanity discovered itself. By the time the last brick was laid upon the ziggurat of Ur, the world had changed forever. The pattern of civilization was set, the rise from mud, the conquest of chaos, the silent return to dust. From that dust, the next chapters would rise, kings, wars, and empires. But all of them, every dynasty, every dream, would trace their beginning back to this fragile plain where two rivers taught mankind to imagine eternity. They made a garden and called it order. They made order and called it civilization. And in the quiet between floods, they listened to the sound of their own creation carried by the wind. That was Mesopotamia. That was the land between two rivers. The first heartbeat of the human world. In the beginning, they built to survive, but soon they began to build to remember. And from memory came ambition. Across the plain of southern Mesopotamia, the early villages of the Ubaid had grown into something unimaginable. Sprawling clusters of dwellings, granaries, workshops, and temples, their walls of clay rising above the floodplain like islands of permanence in a sea of impermanence. Here, for the first time in human history, men looked upon the land and declared, "This is ours." Eridu was the first. The ancients would later call it the foundation of the world. To them, it was not merely a settlement, it was a sacred experiment, a negotiation between heaven and earth. At its heart stood a modest temple of mud brick, raised on a low mound above the waters. It was here, they believed, that the god Enki, lord of the deep, master of wisdom, had first brought order to chaos. Each generation rebuilt the temple upon the ruins of the old, layer upon layer, age after age, until the hill itself became a monument to continuity. Beneath the feet of every new priest lay the footsteps of 1,000 predecessors. To walk those steps was to walk backward through time. That is how civilization began, not with conquest, but with repetition. Not with empire, but with endurance. The people who gathered at Eridu were not warriors. They were dreamers, architects of ritual and memory. They learned that to build upon the past was to defy oblivion. Each brick carried the weight of devotion. Each offering of grain was a promise to the future. From this idea that permanence could be built upon impermanence arose the first city-states of Sumer. As the centuries turned, the land between the rivers filled with their creations. To the northwest rose Kish, to the east, Lagash, to the south, Ur, and to the west, the mighty Uruk, the first true metropolis of the world. These were not mere villages clustered around fields. They were worlds unto themselves, organized, stratified, dreaming. Imagine standing on the plain in 3500 BCE. The air is thick with dust and the smell of wet clay. To the horizon stretch canals glinting like threads of silver. You hear the low chant of workers mixing bitumen and straw, the rhythmic thud of wooden molds as bricks are cast in the sun. And there, rising from the flatness like a mountain summoned from nothing, stands the Temple of Uruk. Its terraces climb toward the sky step by step, as if each level were a thought ascending toward heaven. The walls of the city stretch 7 miles in circumference, enclosing tens of thousands of souls. It is said that from its battlements, one could see the world curve away, a world that now bent to the shape of one city's imagination. In its markets, merchants trade copper from Oman, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Sailboats drift down the Euphrates, their white sails catching the morning sun like wings. Within its courtyards, scribes record the weight of grain, the name of the king, the rhythm of the seasons. They have done what no people before them dared to do. They have created a world not as it is, but as it could be. Uruk becomes the heartbeat of Sumer, a place where myth and reality intertwine. It is here that writing flourishes, that kings rise, that gods are named and enshrined. It is here that the first great poem of humankind will one day be written, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a man who sought immortality and found only truth. But that comes later. For now, the people of Sumer build and build again. Each city competes with the next in grandeur, each temple higher, each ziggurat more daring than the last. The landscape becomes a mosaic of faith and labor, the first skyline of humanity. And yet, beneath the beauty lies an unspoken tension. For in the act of creating permanence, they have also created hierarchy. Where once there were equals, now there are rulers and ruled, priests and laborers, scribes and slaves. Order has its price. The priest kings of Sumer call themselves Lugol, the great men. Their power rests not on the sword, but on the sacred. They govern as intermediaries between man and God, their authority sealed in the clay tablets, stored within the temple archives. The city is not just a home, it is a body, and the temple, its beating heart. Within its walls, the world becomes measurable. Every action has a place, every day a meaning. It is as if the Sumerians, weary of nature's chaos, have rebuilt the cosmos in miniature, a cosmos of brick and rule. But if cities are mirrors of the human soul, then the reflection now shows both light and shadow. Ambition breeds rivalry, pride breeds war. Each city-state, believing itself chosen by the gods, begins to look upon its neighbor not as kin, but as rival. The rivers that once united them now divide them. Canals that carried grain now carry armies. Still, in these early centuries, the dream remains pure, to build something that endures. The Sumerians continue to refine their crafts, metalwork, pottery, sculpture. Their artisans carve inlays of gold and lapis into wooden lyres. Their architects design courtyards that capture both wind and light. Their scholars study the movement of stars, seeking patterns that might explain the pulse of the divine. And through all of it runs a quiet philosophy, that to understand the heavens, one must first master the earth. They believed themselves children of the god Enki, heirs to wisdom drawn from the waters of creation. And in their striving to irrigate, to measure, to record, they were reenacting the myth of Enki himself, bringing order to the abyss. From this mythic vision emerged their greatest invention, the city not as shelter but as symbol. A city was not built for the living alone. It was built for the gods, for the ancestors, for the unborn. To walk through Uruk was to walk through eternity, compressed into streets of clay. The ziggurat became the axis of the world, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. At its summit, priests offered wine and incense to the heavens. Below, the people toiled and prayed. Every brick rose from human hands, but every shadow it cast belonged to heaven. It is easy to romanticize them, these first citizens of civilization. But to live in a Sumerian city was to live within a great experiment, one that demanded obedience, faith, and sacrifice. For in the creation of order, they had also created the fear of losing it. At dusk, when the heat sank into the clay and the horizon glowed like a line of fire, the The cities of Sumer must have looked like something holy. Towers rising from the plain, canals glinting like veins of light, the air filled with the scent of burnt offerings and river wind. Yet beneath that beauty lay a quiet restlessness, the same unease that would one day undo them. For the Sumerians had achieved something extraordinary, but in doing so, they had bound themselves to their own creation. The walls that kept the floods out also kept the people in. The order they worshipped had become a cage of their own making. Still, for centuries they thrived. Uruk became the mother of cities, its influence spreading across the land. Its kings declared themselves chosen by the goddess Inanna, and their reigns were measured not only in years, but in legends. Trade routes stretched farther than any had imagined, north to the forests of Anatolia, south to the Arabian coast, east to the mountains of Elam. Copper, tin, gold, and lapis traveled along the veins of the rivers like lifeblood through the body of the world. But if Uruk was the heart, then the rest of Sumer was its reflection. Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish, each city a microcosm of divine ambition. Each one built temples, carved idols, wrote hymns, and composed the first laws. Each believed itself eternal, and each was wrong, because permanence is an illusion. The rivers shifted their course, the soil grew tired. The irrigation that once brought life began to salt the earth. The harvests waned, and when the gods seemed silent, the kings raised their ziggurats higher, as though altitude could buy forgiveness. This was the paradox of Sumer. Their brilliance was also their burden. The more they built, the more they had to defend. The more they controlled, the more they feared the chaos outside their walls. And so, they turned inward, perfecting the machinery of civilization. Bureaucracy became theology. The temple not only spoke for the gods, it owned the fields, the labor, the very breath of the people. In the archives of Uruk, scribes pressed the names of men into clay, workers, herders, debtors. A man could read the record of his life long before he could read his own heart. Yet even in that system, there was beauty. The tablets speak of music, of love, of longing. One hymn to Inanna calls her "she who walks in the light of the morning star." A letter from a merchant to his wife speaks of missing her voice in the market. The same hands that counted grain also carved lullabies. That is the secret of the first cities. They were not just machines of order, they were theaters of the soul. Every alley, every courtyard echoed with the pulse of creation. The potter's wheel, spinning endlessly, mirrored the turning of the stars. The hammer of the smith kept time with the rhythm of the heart. Even their silence was sacred. From these cities, the world inherited more than technology. It inherited an idea that humanity could build something larger than itself, something that would outlast its makers. The city became the vessel of collective memory, the physical form of a dream shared across generations. To walk through Uruk at night must have been to walk through living history. Torches flickered along the walls. The moon rose above the ziggurat, bathing its terraces in silver light. The priests sang to the heavens, and from the streets below, thousands of eyes looked upward, not in fear, but in recognition. The gods above and the people below mirrored each other. Both sought permanence. Both feared the flood. And in that fragile balance between reverence and defiance, civilization took its first breath. But even as the Sumerians built, the seeds of their undoing were already planted in the soil. The canals that linked the cities could also carry armies. The gods of Uruk were not the gods of Umma. Rivalries festered like cracks beneath the surface. War came quietly at first, raids for water, for land, for pride. But soon, it became the language of kings. The clay tablets that once recorded grain now recorded conquest. The same stylus that wrote hymns wrote treaties, oaths, betrayals. And yet, isn't that the pattern of all civilization? From creation comes conflict. From unity, division. From peace, ambition. The Sumerians could not have known it, but in building their cities, they had built the template for every empire that would follow. The same brilliance, the same blindness. Still, for now, the cities endure. The ziggurats still gleam in the sun. The scribes still write. The children still press their hands into clay. The dream continues, as it always does, until it doesn't. When we look back upon them now, we see the echoes of ourselves. Their desires were ours, to be safe, to be seen, to be remembered. They believed that if they built high enough, wrote deep enough, prayed long enough, they could touch eternity. And in a way, they did. For though their walls have fallen and their rivers changed course, the idea of the city endures, that humans, frail as dust, can gather together and make something immortal. From the mud of Sumer rose the first experiment in permanence. From their failures came our foundations. Every capital, every temple, every poem owes its breath to those who first learned to write their dreams into stone. They made a city and called it the world. They made a world and called it divine. And in the reflection of their towers, the gods saw themselves and smiled. That was Sumer, the first act in humanity's endless play of creation and decay. A people who turned dust into memory, water into order, and silence into song. But the story of the Sumerians is not a tale of triumph. It is a warning written in clay, that every tower casts a shadow, and every beginning carries the whisper of its end. In the centuries to come, those whispers would grow louder. The cities of Sumer would clash, bleed, and burn. Kings would rise and fall, their names pressed into tablets that outlived them all. And as the rivers shifted once more, the land that had given birth to civilization would begin to devour it. But that is a story for another time. The story of ambition, of empire, of ruin. For now, let us remember what they gave us: the courage to build, the humility to fall, and the will to try again. From clay, they made meaning. From chaos, they made order. From the silence of the earth, they made us. And though their temples have crumbled, though their language is lost, their heartbeat still trembles beneath the sand, waiting, as it always has, for someone to listen. They called themselves Ug-Sag-Giga, the black-headed people. Not because of race, not because of pride, but because they believed their color belonged to the earth. To them, to be human was to be made of soil, to be shaped from the dark clay that the gods themselves once molded into form. It was not just their name, it was their philosophy. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium before Christ, Sumer had become a living machine, pulsing, breathing, shimmering with a kind of disciplined chaos. From the walls of Uruk to the docks of Ur, from the canals of Lagash to the temples of Nippur, the land between the rivers sang with the hum of creation. The Sumerians had built not just cities, but systems, not just temples, but thought. They had looked upon the world and decided it could be measured, tamed, and rewritten, that every mystery could be turned into method. And in doing so, they became the engineers of civilization. Look closely at their hands, not the hands of warriors, but of craftsmen, calloused, darkened by sun and clay. With these hands, they transformed mud into monuments and silence into language. With these hands, they built the foundations of everything we still call human. Their genius was not in what they conquered, but in what they created. The wheel, the plow, the sail, the arch, the brick, the law, the poem, the very notion of time divided into minutes and hours. They were the first to give shape to the invisible. Everywhere their imagination touched, the world changed. On the banks of the Euphrates, their farmers guided water through channels that glittered like threads of silver under the sun. They used the weight of gravity to feed the fields, inventing irrigation as both science and devotion. In the workshops of Ur, potters turned clay upon wheels that spun like the planets above, unaware that they had mirrored the cosmos. Their architects, with nothing but reed, rope, and intuition, built structures that would endure for 5,000 years. And at the center of it all, the ziggurat rose, the mountain made by men. No other creation of the Sumerians captured their spirit so completely. From its base, it was nothing more than a pile of brick and tar. But as it rose tier by tier, it became something transcendent, a stairway between heaven and earth. Each level symbolized a layer of the cosmos, the ground of men, the realm of the stars, and the mystery of the divine beyond. At its summit, the air was thin, the silence vast. There, the priests of Sumer spoke to their gods in the language of smoke and song. Below, thousands of workers toiled in the heat, their sweat glistening under the same sun that had forged them from dust. Between those two worlds, divine and mortal, the ziggurat stood as mediator, as mirror. It was a declaration of faith and a defiance of gravity, a promise that man would not remain earthbound. In the temples, the priests recorded the will of the gods onto clay tablets, contracts of heaven written in human hand. In the courts, judges weighed disputes with measured law. In the fields, men used plows of bronze to carve straight lines through chaos. Everything in Sumer bore the mark of balance, the belief that order was divine and disorder a kind of sin. But perhaps their greatest creation was not a monument of stone or a machine of wood, but an idea that knowledge itself could be preserved. The Sumerians invented the library. In their archives, they stored the collective memory of humankind, prayers, poems, contracts, laws, recipes, myths, even the first jokes ever written. Each tablet was a conversation across centuries, a small defiance of forgetting. And from those tablets, we know their minds were as complex as ours. Tender, ambitious, anxious, and afraid. One text records a father advising his son to study hard, to be the scribe who knows the tablet. Another tells of a worker lamenting the cruelty of his overseer. A third speaks of a woman mourning the loss of her child. The house is silent. My hands are empty. The river does not answer. These voices, pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, still tremble when read aloud. In them, we see ourselves. The same love, the same fear, the same desire to be remembered. For the Sumerians, writing was not merely a tool, it was a form of immortality. To write something down was to steal it from the jaws of time. The stylus became their weapon against oblivion. Each wedge cut into clay was a heartbeat turned into permanence. Even the gods of Sumer were bound by this act of inscription. In their myths, destiny itself was recorded on tablets, the tablets of fate, guarded by the gods, dictating the rise and fall of worlds. To rewrite them was to rewrite reality. Perhaps this was their truest insight, that language and creation are the same thing. To name something is to bring it into being. To record it is to make it eternal. Their laws reflected the same principle. Centuries before Hammurabi, before Rome, before Moses, there was the Code of Ur-Nammu, the first legal code ever written. Its preamble begins not with punishment, but with order. The god Inanna, Lord of Ur, gave the king wisdom, that the strong might not oppress the weak. It was a fragile attempt to bind justice to clay, to hold men accountable before something higher than themselves. Even in the earliest days of law, they understood that power without conscience is ruin. In every way, the Sumerians were a people of equilibrium. They saw that the universe was built on tension, and that to survive, man must learn to walk between opposites, between flood and drought, between freedom and order, between life and death. This duality became the soul of their civilization. It pulsed through their architecture, their stories, their songs. They were a people who built from mud but dreamed of eternity. They lived in fear of their gods but dared to imitate them. They understood that creation always came with cost, that the same hands which molded clay into gods could also mold gods into tyranny. And yet they kept building, because to build was to believe. At dawn, when the first light spilled across the plains of Sumer, the ziggurats caught fire with the color of gold. The people would gather in the courtyards below, where priests recited hymns older than memory. Smoke from burning incense drifted upward, carrying with it the prayers of thousands, farmers, merchants, soldiers, children, all bound together by the same fragile hope that their work would please the gods and keep the floods at bay. They believed the gods had shaped them from clay mixed with divine blood, that their duty was to maintain the order the gods had begun. It was not a religion of comfort, but of responsibility. To live was to serve, to build, to preserve. Their devotion was both fear and reverence, a harmony between obedience and awe. In their mythology, the gods were powerful, yet flawed, capricious, jealous, prone to silence. Enlil ruled the wind, Inanna the passions of love and war, Nanna the moon's gentle light. Enki, the wise, whispered to kings in dreams. But the Sumerians never worshipped blindly. Their myths are full of irony, full of the uneasy awareness that even the gods are subject to fate. It is there, in that tension between divine power and human fragility, that the Sumerians found their wisdom. They knew that the universe was not a stage for glory, but a cycle of balance. Flood and drought, joy and despair, life and death. Each gave meaning to the other. That is why, even in their triumphs, there is melancholy. Their hymns praise the beauty of life, but always with a shadow of mourning. They sang not to escape mortality, but to make peace with it. From that acceptance came art. Their sculptures were not idealized fantasies, but portraits of serenity, large eyes gazing upward, hands clasped, mouths small and silent. They carved devotion into stone. Each statue looked not outward to the world, but inward to eternity. Their music, played on lyres of gold and silver, echoed through the courtyards of Ur. The oldest written songs in human history come from their hands. They sang to their gods, yes, but they also sang to themselves, to the fragile rhythm of their own hearts against the endless noise of the world. And through these songs and stories, something remarkable happened. The Sumerians began to see themselves not as servants, but as participants in creation. Their myths tell of Enki giving Inanna, the me, the sacred gifts of civilization, wisdom, writing, law, craftsmanship, art, seduction, war, even deceit. Every gift of progress carried its opposite within it. The Sumerians understood this deeply, that the same forces that elevate humanity also destroy it. It was the price of knowledge. They knew that in building cities they had also built vanity. In mastering the rivers they had awakened hubris. Civilization, for them, was not salvation, but struggle, a constant act of balance between light and shadow. And so they watched the horizon with equal parts pride and dread. The rivers shimmered under the sun, but beneath their gleam lurked salt, invisible, rising, killing the soil inch by inch. The very systems that sustained them were beginning to poison the land. Yet they could not stop. Their gods demanded growth. Their kings demanded tribute. The people demanded hope. Still, they worked. Still, they built. Still, they believed. In this paradox, faith in the face of inevitable decay, lies the true soul of Sumer. They were not naive. They knew the flood always comes, but they chose to build anyway. That is what made them immortal. Walk with me then, through their streets. Hear the rush of the canals, the chatter of traders calling out weights and measures, the distant thud of hammers shaping copper. A scribe kneels in the shade, his reed stylus dancing across a tablet. Children run through the dust, their laughter mixing with the calls of merchants selling oil and barley. This was the heartbeat of the world's first civilization. Ordinary people living extraordinary lives beneath the eyes of eternity. They did not know we would one day remember them. But perhaps they hoped. That is why they wrote, to leave their breath trapped in clay, so that even when their voices fell silent, their words would remain. And remain they did. 5,000 years later, when archaeologists uncovered their cities, they found the tablets still intact, the clay hardened by time, the marks still sharp as if pressed yesterday. And in those marks, the Sumerians spoke again of laws and losses, of gods and grief, of triumph and toil. They told us how they lived. They warned us how they fell. Their words were not boastful. They were reflective, weary, wise. They spoke as if they knew that history is not progress, but recurrence. A wheel that turns, grinding every empire to dust, only for new hands to rebuild it again. And so the Sumerians endure not just in what they invented, but in what they understood, that greatness is fragile, that wisdom is born of suffering, that to create is to risk ruin. Their story is not merely the birth of civilization. It is the birth of consciousness, the moment when humanity realized it could shape the world, but never fully control it. From them came everything: writing, mathematics, architecture, law, religion, astronomy. But beyond those inventions lies something more profound: the awareness that all creation is temporary, and that the act of creating is sacred precisely because of that. They made the world think. They taught it how to remember. And even now, millennia later, the traces of their vision remain in us, in every letter we write, every law we pass, every building that rises against the sky. We are their descendants, not by blood, but by will. They called themselves the black-headed people, children of the earth, makers of meaning, architects of time. From their hands came the shape of humanity itself. And though their temples have fallen and their language turned to silence, their spirit still hums beneath the surface of our world, an ancient frequency, low and eternal, reminding us that we, too, are clay, trying to remember the shape of the divine. They made order from chaos. They made gods from dust. They made us from themselves. That was Sumer, not a myth, not a legend, but the first whisper of eternity spoken in the tongue of men. In the shimmering heat of southern Mesopotamia, the rivers had once sung of life. But by the dawn of the third millennium before Christ, they had learned a new song, the song of conquest. The land that had given birth to the world's first cities now trembled beneath the weight of their ambitions. The Sumerians had mastered the art of creation. Now they would learn the cost of keeping it. Each city that had risen from the plain, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, Ummah, saw itself as chosen by the gods. Each believed its ziggurat touched heaven more purely, its priest-king more favored, its god more merciful. And between them, the rivers flowed like veins of jealousy. Water, that simple sacred element that had once united them, became their greatest weapon. Canals that once fed the fields were dammed to starve their enemies. Floodgates were opened in the dead of night to drown the crops of rival cities. The same hands that had carved channels of life now dug trenches of war. The Sumerians had built the idea of civilization. Now they discovered its shadow: empire. At first, the wars were small, skirmishes between neighbors, disputes over boundaries and irrigation rights. But as the cities grew, so did their pride. The temple archives began to fill not with hymns, but with records of battle, lists of captives, spoils of war, treaties sealed in blood and clay. The gods themselves seemed to take sides. The banner of Inanna fluttered over Uruk, while Lagash marched beneath the symbol of Ningirsu, the storm god. Each city prayed for victory, certain that righteousness flowed only from its own altar. And so, the fertile land between the rivers became a battlefield. From the chronicles, we know their names: Eannatum of Lagash, Lugalzagesi of Umma, kings who carved their triumphs into stone. The stele of the vultures still bears their story, rows of soldiers advancing beneath the standard of their god, the bodies of their enemies trampled into dust. It is one of the oldest war monuments ever made, and even now its message is unmistakable. From blood came order, from order, eternity. Eannatum claimed to have united Sumer under his rule, but unity born of conquest is a fragile thing. When he died, the alliances he forged dissolved like clay in rain. Once again, the cities turned upon each other. Once again, the rivers ran red. And then came Lugalzagesi, a man of towering ambition, a king who dreamed not of one city, but of a world. He marched from Umma with an army of thousands, burning, breaking, conquering. One by one, the city-states fell before him. He crowned himself king of the four quarters of the world. For a moment, brief, brilliant, terrible, Sumer was united. But history, like the river, never stands still. From the north came a shadow, neither Sumerian nor known. A people who spoke another tongue, who looked upon the southern cities with hunger. Their leader was Sargon of Akkad. Sargon was no priest king. He was something new. A soldier, a conqueror, a man who believed the gods had chosen him not to serve, but to rule. He rose from obscurity, a cupbearer to a forgotten king, and through cunning and force, he seized a city, then a province, then a world. He marched south, crushed Lugalzagesi's armies, and carried him in chains to Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil. There, in the temple, Sargon placed his boot upon the defeated king's neck and declared himself master of Sumer. Thus began the first empire in human history. The Akkadian banners replaced the Sumerian standards. The language of the conquerors spread across the land. Sargon ruled from his capital, Akkad, a city now lost to time, its name whispered like a ghost. He was ruthless but brilliant. He established governors in every province, built a standing army, and created the first postal system to carry his decrees along the rivers. Under Sargon, the world was bound together by force and by fear. He called himself King of the Four Corners, echoing the boast of the man he had destroyed. It is said that he conquered until the sea stopped him, that his armies marched across mountains and deserts, that his name was carved on the hearts of men and gods alike. But empires are rivers too. They rise, they flow, and they break. After Sargon came Rimush, then Manishtushu, then Naram-Sin, the grandson who would call himself God of Akkad. Under Naram-Sin, the empire reached its height. He was bold, visionary, and dangerous. He abandoned the humility of his ancestors, proclaiming himself divine while still alive, the first man to crown himself a god. He rebuilt temples in his own image, raised armies that spanned continents, and carved his triumphs into the mountains. One inscription shows him standing alone against the world, his enemies crushed beneath his feet, his helmet adorned with the horns of divinity. To his people, he was invincible. To his enemies, unstoppable. To the heavens, intolerable. For hubris, too, is a kind of flood. It is said that the gods struck Naram-Sin with madness, that omens foretold his fall. The sky darkened, the earth trembled, and the mountains vomited fire. Enemies rose on every side, the Elamites from the east, the Amorites from the west, and from the highlands, a barbarian horde, the Sumerians called the Guti. The empire cracked. The rivers, once mastered, turned against their masters. Famine followed drought, rebellion followed famine. And when Akkad finally fell, it did not fall to a single sword, but to silence. No one knows where its walls once stood. No one knows where Sargon's tomb lies. The first empire of humankind vanished so completely that for thousands of years, even its name was lost. But its shadow remained, and its lesson. The Sumerians, though conquered, endured. Their cities, though burned, were rebuilt. Their language, though replaced, became sacred. The Akkadians had ruled by might. The Sumerians would rule by memory. They returned to their gods, their rituals, their laws, weary, wiser, but unbroken. And yet, even in their renewal, they could not escape the rhythm that ruled all of Mesopotamia. Creation, expansion, pride, collapse. The flood always returns. After the fall of Akkad, the land between the rivers lay in ruins. The canals were choked with silt. The fields lay salted and bare. The people scattered. For nearly a century, chaos reigned. The Guti tribes from the mountains of Zagros ruled like ghosts, fierce, transient, and silent in the clay. They left no art, no temples, no code, only ash and hunger. The great ziggurats of Ur and Uruk stood half buried in the sand, monuments to a memory fading beneath the sun. But history, like the river, never stops at the ruins. From the desolation rose a new voice, quiet at first, then strong enough to shape the air again. The Sumerians returned to their cities. From the north, a man named Utu-Hengal gathered the scattered fragments of his people. He rose, not from a temple or a dynasty, but from the will to restore what had been lost. He drove the Guti from the plains and reclaimed the sacred land. And from the dust of defeat, the Sumerians took one last breath of greatness. In the city of Ur, a man named Ur-Nammu seized the throne. He was a builder, not a conqueror, a king of clay and law. Under his hand, the third dynasty of Ur began, what historians now call the Neo-Sumerian Empire, but what the Sumerians themselves called simply the Restoration. Ur-Nammu's vision was not of conquest, but of harmony, to restore the balance that ambition had destroyed. He rebuilt the canals, cleansed the fields, reopened the temples. He revived the worship of Inanna, the moon god, whose pale light had watched over Sumer since time immemorial. And to honor him, Ur-Nammu ordered the construction of a ziggurat unlike any before, a mountain of precision and prayer rising over the desert. The great ziggurat of Ur was both tomb and testimony, monument and manifesto. Even now, after 4,000 years, its form still dominates the horizon. Its terraces rise in perfect proportion, its stairways climbing like an echo of heaven's ladder. To stand before it was to feel the heartbeat of a civilization pulsing once more. Ur-Nammu also gave the world something greater than stone, the first written code of law. The code of Ur-Nammu predates Hammurabi by centuries. It speaks of justice, mercy, order. Its words are simple, almost gentle. If a man causes injury, he shall pay in silver. If he steals, he shall return what was taken. It was the attempt of a weary people to replace vengeance with reason, to build a civilization not upon fear, but upon fairness. For a time, it worked. Under Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, Sumer blossomed again. Trade flourished, temples gleamed, scribes filled libraries with songs and hymns. Shulgi declared himself the shepherd of his people, a poet king who saw rule as a form of devotion. He completed his father's ziggurat and filled it with offerings of gold, lapis, and cedar. The land breathed again, as if the gods themselves had forgiven. But peace is a fragile gift. Behind the grandeur, the old sickness remained. The salt creeping into the soil, the exhaustion of the land, the slow drift of the rivers. The system that had sustained Sumer for centuries was eating itself alive. Fields turned white, crops withered. The very water that once gave life now carried death. The farmers prayed louder, but the gods gave no answer. And beyond the borders, new powers were stirring. To the west, the Amorites gathered strength. To the east, Elam sharpened its spears. The empire that Ur-Nammu built on law would soon be tested by hunger and war. In the final years of Ur, a man named Sin sat on the throne, a king born too late. He inherited a world already cracking. The canals ran dry, provinces rebelled, famines swept through the cities. His officials betrayed him, selling grain to the enemy while his people starved. From the mountains, the Elamites descended like a tide. The tablets tell us what happened next. They speak of fire, of temples burning, of mothers wailing, of priests burying the sacred statues in the earth to save them from desecration. They speak of the king captured, dragged in chains to Elam. They speak of the city of Ur, consumed by flame, its towers collapsing, its people scattered to the winds. One tablet, written by a priest who survived, bears a lament that still echoes across the millennia. The storm devoured the land. The city we built was swept away like a nest in the reeds. Our gods have gone, our songs are ashes. The river we loved has turned against us. And so the third dynasty of Ur, the last flowering of Sumer, fell. The world's first civilization, which had given us writing, law, and cities, dissolved back into the dust from which it came. Its language faded. Its gods were borrowed by new peoples. Its stories retold in new tongues. Sumer became memory. But what a memory! Even in their ruin, the Sumerians left a pattern that the world would follow forever. Creation, expansion, hubris, collapse, remembrance. The same pattern would echo in Babylon, in Persia, in Rome, in every empire to come. It is the rhythm of humanity itself, to build beyond our means, to mistake mastery for immortality, and to fall beneath the weight of our own design. The Sumerians did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were first. They built without knowing how the story ends. And yet, if one stands today upon the ruins of Ur, beneath the same desert sky, one can still feel their presence. The wind that whistles through the broken bricks carries the same dust they once breathed. The moon still rises over the ziggurat of Inanna, casting its silver light upon what remains. It is tempting to see tragedy here, but there is something else, something deeper. The Sumerians may have vanished, but they achieved what they always sought, endurance through remembrance. They wrote themselves into time. Every word we read, every city we build, every law we make, all of it carries a trace of them. From blood came order, from order, eternity. The rivers of Sumer have long since changed their course, but the current of their ideas still flows through us. They taught the world that civilization is not the absence of chaos, but the courage to build despite it. And perhaps That is what the gods meant all along. For in the silence after the flood, when the smoke of Ur's fall had drifted into the sky, the earth itself must have whispered their final epitaph, not of defeat, but of endurance. They rose from clay and returned to clay, but between the two, they built a world. There is a silence that comes after destruction, a silence so deep it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. After the fires of Ur had gone out, after the last king of Sumer had been dragged into exile, that silence stretched across the plains of Mesopotamia like a shroud. The rivers still flowed, but they no longer sang. The fields lay white with salt. The ziggurats, once alive with song and incense, stood as hollow skeletons against a wind that remembered everything. For a generation, the land belonged to no one. The old cities slept under the dust. The temples were empty, the gods mute. And then, from that quiet ruin, came a whisper, the faintest stir of life, the echo of a people who refused to vanish. They were Sumerians still, but older now, tempered by centuries of rise and ruin. From the ashes of collapse, they gathered again, carrying not pride, but memory. And among them rose a man whose name would become a beacon in the twilight of their civilization, Ur-Nammu. He was not the descendant of kings, but a builder born from dust. A soldier of the city of Ur who saw his homeland broken and believed it could live again. The Guti invaders who had once dominated Sumer were gone, driven back into the mountains by Utu-Hengal of Uruk, a man of courage but brief reign. Ur-Nammu took his place, not through conquest, but through the quiet conviction that order could be reborn. He understood something his ancestors had forgotten, that power could not be forced. It had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, in the hearts of the people. He began not with armies, but with foundations. He dug canals where the land had turned to salt. He restored the temples of the gods who had been abandoned. He opened granaries, forgave debts, and brought the rhythm of life back to the barren soil. In time, his efforts bore fruit. The rivers ran clear again. Fields of barley rippled under the wind like gold. Merchants returned to the docks of Ur, and the city, which had been a corpse, began once more to breathe. And at the center of this rebirth, Ur-Nammu raised a monument that would defy time itself, the great ziggurat of Ur. It rose from the plain like a mountain of precision, a stairway carved not into stone, but into faith. Each tier was aligned with the stars, each brick marked with the name of the king who had given it purpose. Its form was both geometry and prayer, a place where man might once again meet heaven. The moon god Inanna was its patron, his light spilling down the stairways at night, as if blessing every corner of the city. The ziggurat was more than a temple. It was a promise, a statement carved in clay that even after 1,000 years of war, famine, and despair, the Sumerians could still reach upward. It was as though Ur-Nammu was telling the universe itself, we remember, we endure. But his greatest creation wasn't made of brick and bitumen. It was written in words. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the first written code of law known to humanity, was his true monument. Inscribed upon clay for all to see, it began not with threats or divine wrath, but with compassion. To bring justice to the land, to protect the weak from the strong. It was a vision of power restrained by mercy, a fragile dream that men could live not by fear, but by fairness. In those lines, the voice of humanity spoke for the first time. Ur-Nammu did not live to see his full vision realized. He died in battle, as all kings of his age seemed fated to do, his body returning to the same dust he had once commanded. But his son, Shulgi, inherited more than a throne. He inherited a world reborn. Where Ur-Nammu had rebuilt the body of Sumer, Shulgi sought to revive its spirit. He was a scholar, a poet, a ruler who walked among his people. He fortified the borders, reorganized the administration, and declared himself the shepherd of the black-headed people. Yet unlike the tyrants of old, he saw kingship as service, not domination, but devotion. He reopened the road that had fallen to ruin and built way stations along the trade routes, linking the distant cities of Mesopotamia once more. He standardized weights and measures, brought order to chaos, and expanded the reach of Ur across the Fertile Crescent. Under his rule, art flourished, music returned, scribes filled the archives with songs and hymns. It was as if Sumer, in its old age, had found one last breath of youth. In the courts of Ur, scholars debated the nature of the soul. In the temples, poets composed hymns to Inanna and Nana that still survive, their words luminous even through the cracks of time. They wrote of love and loss, of gods who wept for men and men who dared to question the gods. Theirs was a civilization that had looked into the abyss and, instead of despair, chosen beauty. But all golden ages are borrowed. The land itself began to rebel. The fields that had once shimmered with grain began to pale. The same irrigation that had fed them for centuries was poisoning them now. Salt crept upward through the soil, invisible but relentless, turning once rich fields into deserts. The people of Sumer had conquered the rivers, but not the consequences of their own mastery. The water, once blessing, became burden. And beyond their fragile borders, new nations stirred. The Amorites from the west, the Elamites from the east, and the restless nomads from the north. The walls of Ur, though mighty, could not hold back the tide forever. The king's scribes began to record omens, eclipses, strange storms, whispers that the gods were withdrawing their favor. Yet Shulgi ruled on. He built libraries, temples, and monuments as though to outbuild the end. Perhaps he knew that the flood was coming, but he chose to meet it with dignity. Under his reign, the Sumerians achieved something greater than power. They achieved wisdom. They had learned that civilization is not a fortress, but a flame, fragile, fleeting, and beautiful precisely because it can be extinguished. Their last renaissance was not loud. It was not a conquest, but a kind of peace. The peace of a people who understood the cost of greatness, and yet chose to create again. For a century, the world between the rivers glowed once more, not as the blinding fire of empire, but as the steady light of understanding. It would not last. Nothing ever does. But even as the sands gathered again, the Sumerians left something behind. Not the memory of their kings or their wars, but the echo of their perseverance, the proof that humanity, no matter how many times it falls, can rise again. By the time Shulgi grew old, the world he had rebuilt was already beginning to fade. The canals that had carried life for centuries were now sluggish and clogged. Trade faltered. The Amorites pressed against the western frontiers. The Elamites gathered strength in the east. The scribes recorded signs in the sky, comets, storms, blood-red moons, and whispered that the gods were restless once more. And yet, the city of Ur still shone. The ziggurat rose over the plain like a frozen flame. The streets were alive with the hum of markets and the songs of priests. Children played in the courtyards of the temples, and the scent of incense drifted through the air. To walk those streets was to believe that civilization could never end. But time has no mercy for belief. After Shulgi's death, the throne passed to his sons, and the balance he had maintained began to fracture. Bureaucracy hardened into corruption. Governors ruled like kings in their own provinces. The temples grew rich while the farmers starved. The old equilibrium between earth and heaven, between man's labor and the favor of the gods, began to unravel. In the royal archives, the tablets turned from hymns to laments. "The gods have turned their faces from us," one priest wrote. "The flood does not come. The grain does not rise. The people walk as shadows." And then came the Elamites. From the eastern mountains they descended, fierce, organized, relentless. Their banners carried the symbol of their god Humban, their spears glinting like sunlight on water. They swept through the frontier towns, burning the fields, breaking the dikes, flooding the canals. The Sumerian army met them outside the city of Ur, but was shattered. The survivors fled to the temple of Inanna, clutching their idols, their children, their hope. The last king of Ur, Sin, ruled as the world collapsed around him. His letters to his governors, still preserved on clay, read not like commands, but like confessions. "Send me grain," he pleads. "The people are starving. The gods are silent." His words, small and trembling, are the voice of a man watching the end of everything he was born to protect. The fall came like a storm. The Elamites breached the city walls. Fire tore through the temples. The ziggurat, once bright with offerings, was blackened with smoke. Statues of gods were dragged from their shrines, their gold stripped, their faces shattered. The king was captured and taken in chains to Elam, and thus, after nearly 2,000 years, Sumer, the world's first civilization, fell. But the Sumerians, even in ruin, refused silence. Their scribes, those tireless witnesses of history, did what they had always done. They wrote. On clay tablets hardened by despair, they recorded the story of their own destruction. The Lament for Ur is one of the most haunting works ever created by the human hand, a poem not of defeat, but of grief made sacred. It begins not with kings, but with the city itself speaking. "The storm devoured my children, my rivers wept blood. My gods have left their house, and the wind is my only companion." The lament is not a cry for rescue. It is an acknowledgement of loss, a prayer not for salvation, but for remembrance. In those words, the Sumerians gave meaning to their fall. They understood that even the mightiest works must return to dust, but that memory itself can be a form of eternity. And perhaps that was their final act of creation, to give the world the concept of history not as a list of triumphs, but as a cycle of rise, ruin, and renewal. The descendants of the Sumerians did not vanish. They merged with the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Their gods found new names, their laws new languages. The story of Ur became the foundation of every story of empire that would follow. When the Babylonians later spoke of a flood that destroyed the world, they were retelling a Sumerian tale. When the Hebrews wrote of Eden and exile, they echoed Sumer's first dreams of paradise lost. Even the Greeks, millennia later, would inherit their questions about fate, about divinity, about the fragile line between man and God. The world we live in was born from their silence. For they were the first to ask the questions that still define us. What does it mean to build, knowing it will fall? What does it mean to love, knowing it will end? What does it mean to live, knowing the gods are silent? They found their answer in action, to build anyway, to love anyway, to live anyway. That was their faith, not in gods, but in endurance. If you walk today among the ruins of Ur, you will see only remnants, crumbling bricks, half-buried walls, the skeleton of a stairway that once reached toward the heavens. But if you stand there long enough, if you listen to the wind sweeping through the dust, you will hear them. Not their words, but their will. The hum of those who refused to be forgotten. It is the sound of the first human dream, still echoing through the bones of the earth. From that dust came Babylon, and from Babylon came all the empires of history, Egypt and Persia, Greece and Rome, every city that has dared to call itself eternal. All of them inherited the same pattern, the same curse, the same hope. To reach for the divine, to rise above the flood, to leave something behind that the wind cannot erase. Sumer was not merely the beginning of civilization. It was the beginning of the human condition. Every time we build, we echo their courage. Every time we fall, we repeat their fate. Every time we rise again, we honor their memory. They made the first dawn of the human story, and with it, the first twilight. The flood has come and gone 1,000 times since then. The rivers have changed their course, the gods have changed their names, but the dream remains. And so, across 5,000 years, the legacy of Sumer endures, not in monuments, but in meaning, not in power, but in perseverance. They were the first to build a world. We are the children of their memory, and through us, they are still alive. That was the last Renaissance, the final song of Sumer, the civilization that taught the world not just how to build, but how to begin again. The wind moves across the plain where once the rivers sang. The Euphrates is quieter now, thinner, wandering as though uncertain of its path. And somewhere beneath its drifting silt, the bones of cities sleep. Uruk, Lagash, Ur, names that once rang like thunder, now only murmurs beneath the sand. Civilizations do not die as men do. They fade, quietly, slowly, like the light of a setting star. The story of Sumer did not end with fire or flood, but with forgetting. For centuries after the fall, the dust of Mesopotamia swallowed its own memory. The world moved on. New empires rose upon the bones of the old: Babylon, Assyria, Persia. Each carved its glory into the same clay, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, that the bricks beneath their feet bore the fingerprints of those who had built the first walls. And yet, nothing built upon such foundations ever truly disappears. The Sumerians had understood this long before anyone else. They knew that what man makes with his hands is fragile, but what he makes with his mind, what he inscribes into time, endures. They were the first to name the stars, the first to measure time, the first to ask what it meant to exist. And though their temples crumbled, their questions did not. Those questions became the inheritance of the world. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists brushed the sand from the ruins of Ur and found the tablets of clay buried beneath the ziggurats, it was as if the dead had begun to speak again. The stylus marks were small, almost delicate, yet they carried voices that had slept for 5 millennia. We read their words, the prayers of kings, the laments of mothers, the ledgers of merchants, and in them we recognize ourselves. Their language was strange, their gods alien, their world unfathomably distant. But the emotions pressed into clay were unmistakably human. May my name be remembered, Raoul. One scribe, somewhere near Uruk, thousands of years before the birth of Christ. And in reading his plea, we have already fulfilled it. It is easy to think of history as progress, as a ladder that climbs ever upward. But the story of Sumer teaches something different. History is a river, not a road. It twists, it floods, it returns to its source. Every civilization that has ever risen has traced the same curve: creation, expansion, pride, collapse, and each has left its sediment in the current. The Sumerians were the first to set that pattern. They were the template of humanity's ambition, its brilliance, and its blindness. They taught us that order can emerge from chaos, but never escape it. They taught us that the price of creation is decay, and that beauty is made sacred only by its impermanence. If you walk today through the ruins of their world, you will feel it still. That haunting sense of presence within absence. The bricks are broken, the inscriptions worn thin, the air dry as parchment. And yet, there is a silence there that feels alive. As if the stones themselves remember the sound of their makers' voices. It is the same silence that exists in every ruin, the Great Wall, the pyramids, the Acropolis, a silence that speaks not of death, but of endurance. Because to build is to resist the void. To write is to resist silence. And the Sumerians were the first to do both. Their story, then, is not one of failure, but of fulfillment. They achieved what they were meant to achieve, to show the world that civilization is possible, and to show, by their fall, that it is never permanent. When the Babylonians later wrote their own creation myth, they began where the Sumerians had left off. Their god Marduk slays the chaos serpent Tiamat and fashions the world from her remains. It is an echo of the Sumerian story, of order rising from the flood. Even Genesis, that most enduring of beginnings, begins with the same truth. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. We have been rewriting Sumer's dream ever since. Every tower we build, every law we pass, every line we carve into the record of time, all of it is part of the same ancient impulse, to shape chaos into meaning, to leave behind a trace that says, we were here. And though the names have changed, the desire has not. The spirit of Sumer runs like an invisible thread through the ages, from the ziggurats of Ur to the temples of Egypt, from the libraries of Alexandria to the steel spires of modern cities. The materials have changed, but the yearning is the same. To climb higher, to see farther, to preserve something of ourselves before the flood returns. For that is the paradox at the heart of all human creation. We build because we know it will not last. We write because we know we will be forgotten. We reach for eternity precisely because we know we are mortal. The Sumerians understood this long before the rest of the world gave it words. They called their world Kiengir, the place of the noble lords of the earth. But what they truly built was not a kingdom of earth, but of time. They inscribed themselves into the memory of the human race, not by their victories, but by their voice. They taught us that history is not a possession, but a conversation between the living and the dead. Every generation asks the same questions in a different tongue, and the answers never change. What does it mean to live? What does it mean to create? What does it mean to be forgotten? The Sumerians answered not with philosophy, but with example. They lived. They created. They were forgotten. And yet, they endure. To stand among their ruins is to stand at the threshold of everything that came after. The wind moves like a whispering memory through the fractured walls, brushing over the same dust that once clung to the sandals of priests, the same clay that once bore the weight of kings. The air shimmers with heat, and for a moment, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The sound of the stylus against wet clay, the low chant of hymns rising with the dawn. In that silence, time folds. 5,000 years dissolve into a single heartbeat. You begin to understand what they meant when they spoke of eternity, not as endless time, but as continuity. The unbroken thread that connects every life, every dream, every hand that builds. The Sumerians believed that the gods had mixed divine essence into the clay from which humanity was formed. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps the act of creation, the impulse to build, to remember, to give form to meaning, is that divine spark. If so, then every architect, Every poet, every scientist who dares to shape the unknown is part of that same lineage, tracing back to those black-headed people who first learned to master the flood. Their story is our inheritance, not their kings or conquests, but their courage, their insistence that even in a world ruled by chaos, the act of creation is sacred. For in the end, civilization is not a structure of stone. It is a structure of spirit. It is the invisible architecture of memory, belief, and imagination that binds us together across ages. The Sumerians built the first version of it, a city made not just of walls, but of ideas. And though their empire crumbled, that invisible city remains. It lives in every language shaped by their grammar, every calendar divided by their numbers, every myth that retells their truths. It lives in the rhythm of our days, the organization of our cities, the laws that govern our lives. They were the first to write the words freedom and justice, though they could not make them real. They were the first to name the stars, though they could not reach them. They were the first to sing of immortality, though they could not escape death. But what matters is that they tried. From the floodplains of the Euphrates to the high towers of our modern world, humanity has done nothing else but continue that attempt to give meaning to impermanence. Every skyscraper, every library, every piece of art is an echo of their defiance. They made order and called it civilization. They made civilization and called it divine. And in doing so, they made themselves eternal. The archaeologist Leonard Woolley, who uncovered the ruins of Ur in the 1920s, once wrote that when he brushed the dust from a Sumerian tablet and saw the marks of a stylus beneath his hands, he felt the presence of its writer, a man long dead, yet somehow still alive in that moment of rediscovery. That is the gift the Sumerians gave to us, the possibility of communion across millennia. The idea that a thought can survive its thinker, that a voice can outlast its body, that knowledge is a bridge between the living and the lost. They were the first to prove that memory is stronger than mortality. And so, when we look upon their ruins, we are not merely studying the past. We are meeting our ancestors in the mirror of time. The same questions that haunted them still haunt us. The same dreams that lifted their hands to the heavens still lift ours. The same mistakes, pride, greed, hubris, still echo in the corridors of our own cities. In that sense, the story of Sumer is not ancient. It is immediate. It is now. The rivers still flow, not as they once did, but as they must. The flood still comes, not of water, but of change. The builders still build, the poets still write, the kings still rise and fall. The pattern repeats because it was never meant to end. It is not a tragedy, but a truth. The Sumerians were the first to learn that truth and the first to live with it. They left us no prophecy, only a question. And perhaps that is all history ever leaves behind. What will we build before the flood comes again? For the flood always comes, in fire, in famine, in time. It washes away names and nations alike, leaving only what was written deeply enough to endure. The Sumerians understood that, and that is why they wrote, not merely to record, but to resist erasure. Every tablet, every word, every song was a prayer against oblivion. And though the flood came for them, their words survived. Their story became the world's first memory. And through that memory, they achieved what no empire since has ever matched. Immortality, not of power, but of meaning. When we speak of civilization, we speak their language. When we write our histories, we trace their script. When we dream of permanence, we echo their prayer. They were the first to rise, the first to fall, the first to understand that both are necessary. That in the cycle of creation and destruction lies the rhythm of existence itself. And perhaps that is the true secret of eternity. Not endless life, but endless renewal. The Sumerians did not seek to escape death. They sought to make death part of the story, to build something that even time could not unmake, the will to begin again. Their world has long since turned to dust. Their gods are forgotten, their cities gone, but their echo remains, not in the stones, but in us. For we are their afterlife. We are the continuation of their dream, the living clay they once imagined could think, could build, could remember. Every word we speak, every city we raise, every act of creation is their resurrection. They made a world, and the world made us. And though we too will one day fade, our echoes will carry onward, as theirs do now, across the deserts of time, beneath the same indifferent stars. That is the echo of eternity. And it began long ago between two rivers.